Okay, so here I am. Very excited today to be in conversation with Carol Sanford. Thank you for joining me, Carol.
Glad to do so, Dan. Thanks for inviting me.
And well, it's a great pleasure. I mean, I kind of find you this intriguing, enigmatic figure. You know, you're a radical contrarian, a deep thinker. Listening to some of your stuff, it occurred to me that you're an essence diviner, and I had this image of you as being able to help people find these kind of slivers or cracks of potential that are invisible to the naked eye, and then somehow kind of blast them open and work with people, sometimes even to suck whole companies through them.
I like that image.
Oh, great. Yeah, and we're like, it's in some ways, it's like making the impossible possible where everyone wins, you know. So in a company, the customers are winning, the workers at all levels are winning, the earth is winning, the investors are winning.
Yeah, I'm not sure win is even a good metaphor. Nothing wins, because if there's a win, there's a loss. It's like everything is more alive. And I can't take credit. I mean, I love your generosity about the way I work, but it's always a co-creative process. And I'm very picky about who I work with, because it does take a pretty in-depth, systemic, longer view, or deeper view is probably a better way to say it. So I love what I do. I know.
I can see that. You know, I love the feeling, because as we'll explore during our chat, you talk about things like essence and potential, and I get the feeling from your own energy and your podcasts and writings, it's like, well, you're walking the talk. You know, it's happening for you. I wanted to share. You'll know of Ethan Soloviev. Initially, Ethan Rowland. Is it Ethan Rowland? He's a permaculturist.
Yeah, right.
He's done some cool.
Soloviev, right.
We've been in touch because we got into permaculture at a similar time 15, 16 years ago. And I remember one time, and I went back and found it, and I'm sure he'd be happy for me to share this. He said that working with Carol Sanford has been unbelievable, disruptive, difficult, very, very regenerative. Her school was amazing. And ever since I read those words, I was like, wow, Carol Sanford. I'm going to check Carol Sanford out. Alrighty, so maybe we can save time on further introductions. I can fill some stuff in later and list off the books and a bunch of websites and some of the things you do and places people can find out more. My main intention for today is to have a conversation around this project I've been working with for 3.5 years or so, called Making Permaculture Stronger, to have that conversation benefit from your input.
Okay.
And I'd love to start with drawing out and clarifying this distinction between systems thinking, as it's usually understood, and what you call living systems thinking.
Right.
And I get so excited when I hear you talking about this and read you writing about it, because I'd come to a similar awareness in my own work, but it was a lot more vague, and to see you referring to it so clearly has been amazing. So maybe I'll share where I got to with it, and then we can have your comment. So a core theme of my work's been working with permaculture, which is ostensibly all about partnering with living systems. And what I've noticed, though, is that we so often default inside and outside permaculture to ways of seeing and ways of being in process that, as far as I can tell, come from more of a mechanical perspective than a living systems perspective. So, like, the way I sort of see it is a lot of what's called systems thinking actually still starts with the idea of separate objects or elements.
Right.
And then it brings the emphasis, though, to the links and flows, the relationships between them, and then talks about emergence and the pithy statement about the whole is greater than the sum of its parts and all that. But from this place, when we come to create something new, we default to the idea of assembling parts to create the whole, as if we can build a whole living system, something like we'd build a Lego construction, which is, we both know that doesn't work. And another example is the idea of design process itself as a linear sequence. So there's something that we could put into a flow chart where I followed that up, and I'd be curious to come to the topic of feedback later, which I know you've written a book about recently, which originates in a cybernetic mechanical context also. But I discovered the whole idea of a flow chart comes from the factory floor. You know, the idea of the machine separated from the next machine by a conveyor belt. And we think about design process in that way.
Right.
Which is, and a big break there is that this idea of master planning, where we do the planning or the designing, and then we kind of put that little master plan on the conveyor belt, and that goes out to the implementation team, where there's a separation between the thinking and the doing, or the designing and the implementing, which again, we both know doesn't work when you're working with living systems. And yet these understandings kind of sneak in to domains like permaculture, and to me contradicts the essence of what it's all about. So yeah, I'm excited to see you honing in on that and bringing that to your work. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that distinction between living systems as systems thinking and living systems thinking.
It's really helpful to actually understand how this happened, because a lot of it came out of using the Industrial Revolution and the building of machines, which were not cybernetic at that point. They were analog, ran along a line. And then as it became a powerhouse in this country and in Europe particularly, people wanted to be able to be like the machine. And our education system was established about the same time, and it was done with exactly the same model. It's like a production line. And the way production lines are made is they're made up of, as you said, parts that run progressively in one direction. So when you get a school system that's behind the entire process, then every education process is like that, and it then spills over into all the work systems that are in not-for-profits and eventually into families. Now, there's one thing you didn't speak to, but it really helps understand the disaster that this had created, which is once machines were kind of, we were enamored of them and couldn't imagine doing anything else, it was discovered that they didn't work as well for trying to control people. And there was a guy named John Watson who came in and said, well, of course, people are not machines. They are controllable in the same way. And if you'll give me money, I'll go build a lab here at Johns Hopkins, and I'll develop a way, and I guarantee you will be able to control your people very shortly thereafter the way machines do. And that John Watson is the founder of behaviorism. And of course, what he did is studied rats. And so if you manage to work with rats, his theories are great. If you don't, they're not. So even he, when he was studying a life form, went from machine to something that's alive, he segmented it out from its ability to function as a living creature. And so we have two sets of theories that cause us to fragment and to linearize and to see everything as problems. That's the other thing that happened out of this is we cannot imagine working on anything without first defining its problem. And that's a part of every research project. It's part of every doctoral dissertation. And so the mindset that not only is it fragmented, but now you've got to find a part of that that has a problem. And now you narrow in on that and you discover a solution. Living systems do not have problems. I dare you to show me a forest that is sitting around in some session, or I grew up a lot in farming, and then I was married to a forester, where I used to tease my husband all the time. And I said, well, what does the forest say is the biggest problem? He'd laugh at me, because the problem-solving mind is the fragmenting mind. So living systems instead are looking at the interactive, dynamic nature of that which it takes for the whole to profit and evolve. And that process doesn't have any such thing as any part winning, because even your terms win, 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 that's a fragmented idea. This wins, that wins, that wins. Well, there's no winner or loser. The whole system goes down when any section of it does. So how in the world do you get to living systems? You would want them to know the answer to that, right? How do you get from this fragmented? I'm sorry to tell people that it's not a list of things you can go do, and then you're no longer doing the fragmented part and the machine version, and now you're doing living. You actually have to build a different mind. We have done so much damage to our way of seeing the world, our perspective, our paradigm we hold, that we literally cannot conceive of it. So when I say to people, watch something alive in your mind, like watch a frog, and people think in order to understand a frog, you have to cut it up, put the names on it, name what each part did, and somehow that would add up. what you do to understand a frog, if you can't go into a forest or a pond or something and be frog-like, is you literally have to image it working in context. We don't have a mind that can do that. We can't image things alive and dynamic and changing it. There is also no transactional nature within any of those living systems. You have to see how the systemic effect is happening. Now, I'll be happy to describe to you, and I've got a big part of this in the book that's not out yet, the one you don't have, number 5, which is the Regenerative Human, about how you go about building that mind, and how I learned this from my half Mohawk grandfather. He grew up for a very brief time on a reservation in Oklahoma, which is another long story about how in the world a Mohawk from the Northeast got into Oklahoma. But that process of learning to see the world differently requires being raised differently or else getting immersed in it. And of course, I do that with companies, because a company can't actually understand its clients, customers, unless it can understand them in the context of the ecosystem they are in, and the ecosystem which they're a part of. Part's not a good word. Part is a fragmented word. So you have to watch yourself all the time, right? So it's an aspect or it's a window, and words are a good way to catch yourself. But you have to spend time learning. And if you want to hear about that, I'd be glad to describe at some point what are the principles and the way you go about learning to see a living system. But you were right on.
Yeah, beautiful. I would love that so much. Oh, yeah, I'm feeling this excitement building. So you probably don't know this. I was at university, I was 15 years or something, and I had a PhD in psychology, and I started with Watson. And
of
then
course.
I got into B.F. Skinner, and for a time, I was actually, I'm embarrassed to admit this to you, Carol, but I was a fan of B.F. Skinner.
Well, almost all of us were. When I entered, I worked on a doctorate in psychology too, and I went in the cognitive direction, but you had to do, a survey of everything. Yep. And I remember when we were studying John, well, of course, by then it was B.F. Skinner, most we were studying. Who remembers John Watson? And I remember at the time, an internal part of me rebelling, but I wanted to get my doctorate. I took the courses. You did what you had to do, except when it came to doing my dissertation, I got in tons of trouble over and over again because I could not do the behavioral view, which is the way most science is defined now. Well, you're a recovered behavioralist.
That's right. Yeah, I just had a flashback. I got an interesting conversation with a cognitive psychologist on a boat on a ferry once, because I was wearing a T-shirt that I had made up, and on the front it said something like "behaviorism is better," and on the back it said "I'm with Skinner." And I did a third-year project on chickens instead of rats. They were using chickens in this perspective for the reinforcement.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, but that wore off pretty fast. And the way I tend to work is I immerse in something deeply and then find its edges and its cracks, and it falls away and get on to the next thing. One person I ended up having a lot of respect for was John Dewey, the American philosopher, who in 1896 he wrote that article on the reflex arc concept in psychology, where he was striving towards a more authentically holistic approach, where rather than saying stimulus and response.
Right.
Because I mean, we might come back to this later on. Actually, one thing I realized in my time with psychology was that psychology, when it started, it was posturing as a science, right? And it was a young science, and the pressure was on, because physics had already was years ahead, biology was years ahead. So it kind of had pressure to measure up and deliver the goods and prove that it was a science to its older siblings. And one thing it did was took that fatal shortcut of, rather than developing the concepts, methodologies, processes, even units that were appropriate to its own unique subject matter, it imported them from outside. So it ended up with like ideas of mechanical causation from physics, and in particular from biology, the idea of stimulus and response, which is what Watson, in a sense, was the person.
Well, my last book that came out in December at the end of last year, 6 months ago, is called No More Feedback, Cultivate Consciousness at Work. And what I did is went and looked at the history of how feedback got into our system. And it came in exactly where you're talking about. Wow. Something called the Macy conferences, which were primarily physics scientists, few other sciences, not many earth sciences, but, biological sciences, mostly earth. But the psychologists showed up for exactly the reason you said they wanted to. And they had no ground to stand on. And so all of the ideas that came out of physics, which feedback does, I mean, feedback is literally the process of working with a governor on a production something, spewing oil, whatever, that it gets feedback, the governor gets triggered, and it shuts off an overflow. Well, just image, that's exactly what you're trying to do usually when you talk to people. I'm going to give you feedback I tell people feedback it doesn't even work with rats, which are alive. It is the thing that works with machines. And it all came about because psychologists had no foundation. And so they adopted completely the physics descriptions. And out of it came the writings, and their names were on it, all the psychologists at the time, until the human potential movement reacted not only against the behavioralists, but also against this idea that people were like machines.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, I remember the Macy. I followed, looked back through that with Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, Ashby, Norbert Wiener, that whole scene. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Although they weren't the biggest voices in it. You and I go look for people like them, the big voices, and I can't remember their names, are not popping in my head. I have a lot of them in the One More Feedback book, but they were primarily physicists, including astrophysicists and people. So
yeah,
anyway,
fascinating. And I'd love to come back to feedback. Like that's a case where I'm like, the whole feedback thing, I'm like, damn, because certain things like you're brainstorming, I'm like, yeah, I'm with that. Feedback, I'm like, oh, Carol, come on. Can I just have a bit of feedback sometimes?
No,
I love it.
And it doesn't exist in nature. There is no feedback in a living. There is no one system that says, I've got to shut that off, I'm getting too much. No, that's an inability to see that there is an interactive dynamic. It's like the mycelium, except it's happening everywhere, where things can communicate without having to do it directly, like physics tells us, and are able to have conversations for a system to be whole. But humans, we've forgotten our role in it, and we've forgotten how that works.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and to me, what excites me about things like permaculture and your work, the regenerative paradigm, all that work, to me, it's crafting a pathway, a portal back into nature, which isn't, it's like, I'm sure you write about this, but so often the process we use to try and weave ourselves back into the thread of the rest of nature, the process itself is the very thing that tore us apart in the first place.
Right, right.
This painful.
Well, and suddenly I had a really interesting experience. I mean, this whole idea of living systems and regenerative both are such hot words. I've been using them for almost 45 years, and the concept that's behind them, and everybody is adding. I wrote a paradigm paper on the regenerative paradigm, sent it out, and I said, what I want to do is show what regenerative, the way I'm working on, is from a living systems view. That makes all the difference. The next week, literally all the people who received that paper, their websites added the word living systems to it. Like, all we have to do is name it that, right? It'll be there.
That's it.
I've done a talk, I think it's on Omega Institute's website. I could find it if it matters. And I was sick as a dog, so I can hardly remember what I said, but there were 4 different paradigms of, quote, living systems. And what it meant was different people are using life forms. Like biomimicry is not a living system. It is a fragmentation and an actual use of nature. It's not trying, how you can watch something the way nature watches. Well, there's no such thing, because everything that cleans doesn't, even in one watershed compared to another, I call them life sheds. See, watershed's another fragmented idea. That's a life shed. The minute we do that kind of use of something and genericizing it, it's no longer about living systems. There's no generics, although, Aristotle and a few other folks tried to create typologies which could put everything in a box. Nature doesn't work that way. It absolutely, in no place with humans, animals, biota, work so that there's a generic description out of which you could create the right kind of boxes.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, that's great. Love to. We'll go in all sorts of different directions here. So maybe I mean, I'd love to bring your perspective, as I mentioned in inviting you to this chat, to look at permaculture and also this idea of making permaculture stronger. Yeah, I mean, just a real quick comment on biomimicry. I feel very similarly, and a big part of where I'm coming from is, because permaculture is also about mimicking nature or creating nature mimicking systems. It's like, what does that involve mimicking? If we're mimicking the outcomes, so if we're taking the shape of the whatever kingfisher's beak and using that to design the front of a train, it's like that's a tiny fraction of how exciting this can get. What would it mean to mimic the process? The actual way that nature creates these outcomes.
You don't even want to mimic. Mimic by its definition is not a living system. Nothing mimics anything else.
Right.
What you do is you look at what's the essence of it and how it works. So you look at, let's talk about a wetlands. You know, so I know people who are trying to mimic wetlands. Well, you can't mimic it by its functional aspects. If you want to understand it, and analogies get you in trouble, metaphors get you in trouble because you try and force something so it fits. We have to learn to go look at an individual human, an individual wetland, an individual life shed, an individual farm or agroforest, which is within a context of those other things, and look at how it's working. Not try and mimic it, not try and borrow, not try and use it as an allegory, not try and use any parts of it to please us, but learn to activate the mind that can watch this unique. Well, let's do it at a level people can usually grasp it. If you said, I have a child, my first child, firstborn, was so amazing, they did so unwell in school, I'd like to mimic for my second child what they did. And what I'm going to do is go study all the things. I'm going to come up with the criteria of perfect child, and then we're going to make sure we teach that to child number 2. And we will work on any specific problems that show up of child number 2 who can't do what child number 1 did. I mean, it breaks your heart even to hear me go through that description, right? To think about that poor second child, and actually that poor first child who somehow is now supposed to be the perfect child. What you want to do is understand what's the essence of child 1. And their essence is something that's at a very deep level, that if that went away, they wouldn't be themselves anymore. It has nothing to do with what they do or their grades. So it may be like, I have a grandson that is powerfully smart and he is very connected, but what is the essence of Max is really his ability to be totally present with a complex idea and to understand what's feeding and fueling people's interpretation of that. Now, that's just amazing to me. He's 19 years old, and he can tell you how, because he's always interested in wherever he goes. Now, I don't want to copy him and make his little sister have that powerful idea. Her way is to be able to express with her body that which her heart feels. And she does it in everything. If you can't see that essence, you can't engage with it as a living system. You're engaging it with a set of generics, which are like certifications, competencies, they're all over the world. So.
Thanks, Carol. I hereby pledge to do what I can to delete the word mimic from my vocabulary.
Great.
Yeah, and it would, and as you talk, it's not. It is the wrong word. You know, I'm talking about. I don't know.
No, it's the wrong idea.
Yeah. Like what I'm like the idea I have when I think I use that word inappropriately is around. What did you say? What would you say, Carol? Repartnering, like learning from. You know,
no,
being in process as nature is in process. How would you put it?
What you just did is made us separate. Learn from. See, that's the other problem with biomimicry. Us and them are separate. Yep. We're not nested at any moment. You have to regenerate it at every moment in time for each person wherever they are. So you don't want to. You don't want to look at any one thing and ask, what can I learn from it? That's a metaphorical study. What you want to do is look at the living system you're embedded in, and you want to understand at this moment in time with this system, what is my role? What is my work? How is this system working? How can I support and give and engage? How can I receive what it is that's mine to receive in this process? So partnering is not even a good word. Because it's role in the system. One of the things that also drives me crazy is people talking about, I'm trying to figure out my life purpose. You know what I say to them? You do not have one. You are a human being who has a role in a system. And it's an egotistic idea that I personally have a purpose. Now, I'm involved in things that have purpose, and I have a role in supporting those things. And I may be a part of a community that has some purposeful activity, but there's no in-state purpose. It's like purposeful means making the system as a whole work? And even this is hard to talk about, right? Does it kind of make you crazy when you try and image? If I can't talk about that, me partnering, then what are you saying? What can I say? And eventually I make people so nervous, they say, well, I know you don't like this word. I said, no, I don't like the idea. It has nothing to do with the word, right? And, you know, it's my job to destabilize, to disrupt, so that people have to question and become curious about learning about a way to think about things. And of course, I mostly do that with companies. You're trying to do that as a permaculture practitioner. When you go in, people say, well, I'd like the color red here, and I would like a certain color thing. And you're saying, you know, well, have you even noticed how the water moves here? And whether, and that if we get rid of all animals, and you want me to do this in a way there's no animals around, the system can't stay alive because it depends on the, and you think they're crazy and they think you're crazy. Well, they do the same thing, except usually I can find a handful, dozen, 2 dozen, 4 dozen over my lifetime, folks who get what I'm talking about, and they've never been able to be understood in the world around them, or they've never been able to make sense of the craziness that people had about how they ran businesses. So we get to educate everybody in the organization. And I've done that with DuPont. I have done it with Seventh Generation, with so large and small. That process for me is about making the business work well, because business is very powerful. But I'm really working on building the capacity for living systems consciousness in every person in that organization, every member in their family. I do the podcast, the Business Second Opinion, so people can see how I think when I look at the insanity. And I kind of examine Harvard Business Review one article at a time, taking a living systems view and showing why and how crazy we end up designing things because we have the wrong mind, this old crazy mind that's used to fragmenting and thinking like a machine, and was educated and probably was a high achiever, did really well in school because they were able to do that fragmented work, but they're not much used to whole systems.
No, beautiful. Yeah, I mean, it's I did have that consciousness going into this. Was like, oh shit, it's not like I'm going to get off the hook. Carol's going to grill me, and I felt a little fear around that, but also the deeper excitement. And now I want to just keep going and get as much out of this as I can. Now I'm not going to give up though. I'm going to have one last attempt at getting to something to see if you're okay with it. So I'm down with that. We're not the futility or the wrong idea-ness of talking about mimicking nature, even learning from nature, even partnering with nature, because it all implies exactly as you say that prior separation of What about this, Carol? Re-becoming the nature we already are, something like that.
We aren't nature. We aren't nature. We are a part of a living system. There's nature, there's human, there's biological. The minute people say we are nature, I said, no, we're not. We are in a nested system. And the minute we think of ourselves as nature, we're back to trying to, what could we learn from bees? What could we learn from ants? What could we learn from forests? Well, as far as I know, humans have their own work to do. If we're off studying those, it's like not much different than studying rats. Now, those beings are extraordinary beings, but we want to understand how it is we work with ants, with insects, with biota, and the process that's in the ground, and what is our role in making that work. And that's part of your job. Permaculture, if I had to define what I think permaculture is about, and I talked to Joel Vansberg and Tim Murphy and Ethan and all those folks about all this all the time, the work of a permaculturist is to actually have humans get re-embedded in a living system, not in nature. Nature is embedded in that living system also, and to understand that everything in that living system has a role to play. And if we're watching it all, but it takes a long time to actually see it. We keep doing what you're doing, wanting to learn from it, partner with it, do good things for it. Okay, there's another big challenge. So we have the machine paradigm, we have the behavioralist paradigm, and then along came the humanist paradigm. And the humanist paradigm is when people started saying, well, I want to do less harm. I want to get over just the less harm. I want to do good. I would like to introduce you to a few 100,000 native peoples, indigenous peoples in countries around the world where well-intended humans came in and said, we want to make your life better. We're going to separate your children from you, and we're going to put them in schools, not let them speak that old language and make them learn to speak English, have them learn to be a Christian person. You stop wearing those clothes you're wearing. And all of that was done in the name of doing good. Every bit of it, every colonization process is in the name of doing good. Every taking over of every piece of land, peace, there's no peace. So you have to catch me, stop me, I can't use the word peace. Every aspect of a living system, we have to learn to be able to see it work and not think that it is our job to do something good. And the environmentalists, and I'm using that term intentionally, saw that some time back, like in the 80s when I was watching environmentalists and PETA, to stop the misuse of animals, all trying to do something. But the problem was that they weren't actually, the way they wanted to do it was stop humans from interfering. Because they could say, oh yeah, the problem is humans don't know and they can't know. Well, that's not true. They can know and they have an obligation to learn to understand all this. And if they can learn to understand and see it, then they can be in the process with it. But they are never supposed to be doing good. So when I hear, I often say to people who are in the sustainability movement and other circular economy, all those are about doing less harm. Let's just reduce the impact. That's, if we go back to our children analogy, that's like saying beat our children less, doesn't make our children healthy. So the process of learning to be able to see these as living entities, which we are engaged with, and not our job to do something to, and not our job to run away and do nothing for fear we will do harm. It is our job to learn to have a mind that can see life at work and what role humans play in that process. All right, there's one of my tirades on one of your words.
Yeah, beautiful. So, I mean, I'm going to have to sit with that because that's pretty much everything else you've said. It's like, I feel like I can grasp it at least, and it'll take some time to catch up with it. But this idea that we're not a part of nature, that nature is embedded in the living system and we're also embedded in the living system. Yeah, I guess I'll just take some time with that, but I'm grateful for that prompt.
Get back to me.
I will. Yeah, I'll follow you up on that one for sure. Now, I'm quite keen to get into the tangible reality of, okay, so a lot of our listeners right now, including me, is one of them. We work as permaculture design consultants. So we walk into a property. There's some people there, whatever the pattern is. Sometimes they've made the money in the country and they've in the city and they moved to the country. They bought a block of land or whatever, or they've been. That's a common scenario. But one way or another, we're encountering a land that has been made a piece, right? It's been partitioned out by fences, and these people. And we're brought in to support them on their journey of developing this landscape. And one thing I thought it'd be useful for me and listeners to explore with you is applying the way you'd approach coming to understand that living system, or things like going through existence. What gets presented to you, which includes the problems that people will tell you about, going through that down into the essence, and then moving from essence to potential, to development of potential, to so on up through these regenerative principles you talk about. And I'd love to explore this idea of how you think about parts and wholes.
There are no parts.
I paused so you could say that.
Holes within holes, nested holes.
Yeah. Well, I'd really love to break that open with you. That excites me. So there's a couple of perspectives, and I feel like you would have an affinity for some version of them, possibly not my wording of them, but I'd love to see how you think of it. So one of them is this idea of nested holes.
Mm-hmm.
And Arthur Koestler, and the idea of a holon, and the idea of a holarchy. It's nested holes all the way up and the way down.
Yeah,
perspective on that. What do you think about holons and holarchies?
No.
Okay.
I mean, it's not they're not true, but we're misapplying them, and people misapplied it to business and made an absolute mess out of it. Uh-huh. I do believe it's better to think of as holes within holes, because often what people do with holons is they actually begin to look at parts, and they say it's a holon. No, it's part. No, well, there's no such thing. So I think it's a trap that people have taken something out of physics. It works when you work with lasers. And again, the metaphor obviously gets in the way and gets us in trouble. So not a big fan, but I'm a great fan of the idea of nested holes. And the reason is that it forces the mind to keep understanding the hole in which something is embedded. And if you do that, you're keeping it alive. The minute you have a hole on, you have most likely made it not alive. In holarchies, for the most part, right now, the way it's being used, not the way Arthur Clarke meant for, not Arthur Clarke, what's his name? Creator of the idea of holarchy.
Arthur Koestler.
Author, right, Koestler, had an author. The way it's being used right now is to create a generic set of things that flattens everything. Gets rid of bosses and stuff. I've never in an organization got rid of bosses. I radically invite them to change their role and educate them. And suddenly they're playing a role and it has nothing to do with power. My most recent podcast, which will be out tomorrow, which you can go listen to, is saying that part of what happened is it's not that humans, well, a guy named Jordan Peterson says hierarchies are natural. And I argued in this podcast that he's right, but completely wrong about what he means about it. Because he's saying we as humans were designed just like lobsters and everything else to be stacked. Some are more powerful than others. It's actually an inability to actually understand the concept of hierarchy. Hierarchy is actually an ability of the mind to see at different levels of complexity, which is what we're talking about here. So if I go to a wetland and I look at a watershed, or let's go to a new lovely ranch that someone just bought in New Mexico and invited you in to do permaculture, that exists in a life shed, which exists in a larger life shed, and that has a history. I mean, I always start with what's the story of this place. It's why I always bring in Joel and Ben and Ethan and all these guys. Well, not Ethan, but in that case, but story of place, because that makes me go look at, in a deep level, the geology, the hydrology, the biology, the settlement patterns, the economic patterns, the cultural patterns. Now all of those things are patterns, right, which have to do with life at work. So if I get into the idea that I'm trying to flatten everything, I'm back into a flatland view, which is very easy to fragment. And that's what I see people doing. So I love holes within holes because it mandates that your mind see each of them alive and working in an interactive dynamic.
Hey, tell me what you think of this, Carol. You've used the word aspect as an alternative to piece, part, fragment.
It's not an alternative. It's a different window. It's a different idea. It's not a thesaurus. You want to know the difference?
Sure. Yeah. And then I'll...
So, the facet in a ring has to do with how the light hits it. It doesn't break up the ring. And an aspect is the same kind of thing. It's a facet. It's an ability to see through a different door. And the more windows you look in, the more you're able to see it. Part breaks it away from the whole, and now it's not alive. And so not working. So it's not a substitute. It's literally a different mind at work.
Yep. Yeah.
You got that one.
Yep. And
hard to do an interview with me, isn't it?
Oh, it's a nightmare, but it's a beautiful nightmare. And I'm up for this sort of stuff. I love it. I'm not feeling like I'm
good.
Made to look like an idiot in front of Carol. It's like,
no,
this is great.
You're not.
I'm taking a hit for the team. Historically, aspect was also a verb, so aspecting was something you could do.
Right.
And I use this in my work, where aspecting is to see in the whole, to see in system.
Right. Exactly.
There we go. All right. I thought you'd like that.
So that just made up for all your behavioralism. And the study of chickens.
That's right. Yeah. Pushing red and green buttons. Now, this is the other perspective, and I'll be really fascinated to see what you make of this, because on the one hand, you talked about the problem with metaphor and analogy and laser stuff from physics. On the other hand, I know that you're a fan of, or at least you refer to the work of David Bohm and the implicate order, that stuff.
Right.
And a big influence on me is a guy called Henry Bortoft, who was not only a student or a junior colleague of Bohm, but also of John Bennett, who in turn was a student of Gurdjieff. And one of the ideas that I've been getting value from in my work from Bortoft, and just pardon my use of the word part, just we can unpack it.
I'll let you go with it.
Great. So that I talk about moving from a representational to a holographic way of perceiving a system. So in the past, when you run into a site And as a permaculture designer, the idea can be like, I've got to run around, I've got to map every tree, every water flow, every da-da-da. And when I understand all these parts, then I can assemble a picture, and then I will arrive at an understanding of the whole. What Borthoff says, no, that's completely, there's a different way of going about it. He's influenced by Goethe as well, where contained within each, let's say, aspect of the whole is information about the whole. And so if I get into a relationship with this tree, which sits within this 100-acre farm, this tree, there's a lot of information in this tree that I can learn about the whole. And one of the most beautiful examples I'll share a couple just quickly. One is Tom Brown Jr., the tracker, who I think of because I've heard you talking about your time with your grandfather at the age of 7.
Right. He taught me tracking, only I didn't know that's what he was doing.
Yeah. I've seen John Brown Jr. walk up to a little patch of grass and put a stick next to it, and then to explain that this was the track left by dingo 2 days ago. And so he's looking at an aspect of the situation, and then he'll proceed to tell you the gender, the age, which way it was looking, where it was injured, the fullness of its bladder, all that stuff. So he's reading a lot into the whole from this little aspect. And then David Holmgren, the co-originator of permaculture, who I tag along with on reading landscape excursions sometimes, similar sort of thing. He'll pick up a rock, a little rock, and hold it in his hand, and that, it's like the way I see it, following Borthoff's language, the wholeness of this site, something of the deep wholeness of the site shines through or twinkles through that rock and kind of whispers it to him. And it's like, by encountering these aspects in this way, rather than just an audit or whatever, it's like you're inviting, or you're more able to let the site reveal its secrets to you. So I wanted to see what you made of all that.
Yeah, so there's an inherent problem for most people listening to what you're saying. And it's the same thing. I don't know whether you know Mark Moray, who's also another tracker. Yeah, but he's also in a part of my change agent groups that Ethan and Joel and Tim and all these guys hang out with me. One of the things that happens is people think you're actually getting it from the rock or the piece of scat or the adding up of all this stuff. You are not. The mind, and I know this from watching my grandfather, the mind was not about the particular pig that we were talking about. It was about seeing that pig in a living system, seeing its ancestors, seeing its progeny, seeing exactly what that piece of land was. And so it's like Star Trek, where there's a holographic thing that comes from it. But most people, when they hear you say and read Borthoff, they do the same thing. I haven't read Borthoff as much, although I've got some folks in my group who are, so I'm going to go back and reread. But I think that this idea that the thing holds the answers to something is a misrepresentation of the process. It is being able to see the dynamic interactions in different space, different time, the sense of eternity, and how that had to be playing out to be there. So if you think you're going to go study a rock and understand a planet, then you're back in the old fragmented mind. You're not in a living system mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It does. Yeah, but it's great. So yeah, it's great to hear that conversation is happening, because I sense there is real value in what Borthoff was pointing at. But it does. It's this big, I mean, the other thing that resonated with stuff you say. You talk about imaging something in context, and Borthoff draws on Goethe's idea of what he calls exact sensorial imagination, which is to understand something. You go through a process. Sometimes you actually will do a sketch, I think, but it's about imagining in as much detail as you can in your mind, this idea of imaging and how that can kind of open up the dynamic reality of the thing you're encountering, and help you get out of this idea that the world is primarily made up of static objects that occasionally move around.
Right.
But it's beautiful to be able to sort of crash test some of this stuff against you, because I'm
yeah. So here, there's another thing about, and a little bit of the problem I have, and I know Borthoff does too, and Bohm had the same problem, is languaging what you can see in your mind with the Western world, which is an alphabetic language, is basically impossible.
Yeah.
And so you have to write long sentences. You have to use metaphors. So I have to go to a child. I used to go to human metaphors when I'm trying to teach, just so I don't get people off on looking at rats and leaves and things. But just think of the term sensorial imagination. Now, I don't use the word imagination for the reason that it is mostly made up of fragments which people put together and project into some kind of future. I use the word imaging because it means you have to watch it alive and moving. I also don't use sensorial because it's not the senses that's doing the work. If it were, then we'd have eyes that actually saw what we need to see. You know, our eyes pick up and see it in a pretty static way unless it moves. We have to, in the mind, be able to image it in a dynamic form. So I'm pretty much on board with Bartov, except for I think the language would be better if it were interactive dynamic imaging than it were sensorial imagination. Because I think those are different level of image, are different level of language and meaning and energies. And when I teach people how to think and how to look at their own thinking and how to learn to watch what their thinking is doing, what it's producing in their mind, and why it's causing fragmentation. And languaging is one of the most important pieces because it actually, unfortunately, fortunately, takes us askew. There's one other thing about Western world language, which gets us in a lot of trouble. And I bet you if Bohm had this idea, I would have loved to have had a conversation about what he thought. We now know that Western world languages, most of them anyway, are future tense based. We're always talking about what the future will be, long term, getting out to somewhere, goal oriented. Whereas Asian ideographic languages are present tense based. Now, that doesn't sound like a big thing, except it means you can live in the present and you're not always trying to project to the future. So, for example, in my world, you can translate this to permaculture if you'll help me. I say strategic planning, what is it? And people say long-term thinking. I said, no, it has nothing to do with long-term thinking. Strategic thinking is how do I be here? How do I engage now in a way that this could work the way it needs to be working? And I do that today, and then today, and then today, because it's that process of getting over the future tense and and we know as a result, the Chinese who are present tense thinking, believe it or not, they have safer sex than all of us in the Western world. They save more money. They tend to not get into debt because they don't have a sense of that they've got to do something for the future. They say, nope, got to do it now, right now. So all of those things compound, and we got off on that because of Bartov and
I love that. I'd love to come back to that. Yeah, look, in my PhD research, I really went into this whole thing, and I mean, it's so hard because it's like you're trying to think your way out of fragmented thinking with a thinking apparatus that's fundamentally built on, and the whole idea of subject verb object. So it's like before you can even have a verb like a process denoter, you need to come up with a friggin' subject to make it happen.
Right,
so
whether there's a subject or not.
You have to say the river is flowing, or it is raining. It
is raining, right?
Yeah. That's
now
right.
all of these are problematic.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's I love this statement I read years ago from Quine, which was ontology recapitulates philology. You know? The structure of the reality as we understand it is actually a reflection of the way our language has sliced it up.
Right.
But coming back to this idea of fabricating versus generating, and we'll see how we go. I think it'll be fun to come back to the idea of essence and encountering a landscape and some people in terms of practical insights for permaculturists. But I just said fabricating versus generating. What I meant was what you were just saying, this idea of being in the present. And that's a huge thing that I'm grappling with and working with, is that just the power of this idea that we sit down and we intellectually think about a plan for the future, and then we impose the plan, and how that completely destroys your ability to be present and to do the right thing, as opposed to...
And to see things alive. Because now they're dead. They're on a plan and we're implementing a plan.
You've killed it. You've destroyed it before you even start. Exactly. Yeah, and I don't know if you're aware of the work of the radical architect Christopher Alexander, but from him...
Oh, yeah, I went to Berkeley.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I was at Berkeley with Thomas Kuhn
Wow.
that wrote this. I mean, I'm old, and I was there when those guys, and Christopher was still younger. But yeah, no, I know Christopher Alexander. I don't know him, but I know of him and sat
Yeah.
next to him.
Well, I mean,
Like,
he's probably the primary inspiration on a lot of my thinking and my work. And one distinction I've gotten from him is between fabricating and generating, where fabricating is upfront planning, master planning,
right.
then effectively opposing it. And he says that because no one can predict even the reality of how a building is going to get built, let alone a living system. It's impossible to know, and so to try and plan it up front means that what you're building, it's fragmentary and it has to be full of mistakes. So any master plan is effectively a big assemblage of mistakes that we then try and impose on the world, as opposed
You'd
to
be better if you developed a set of principles
Yeah.
and concepts, and then went to the place and began to understand how you join with what's there.
100%. Yeah. And that's what he means by generating is the alternative. So how
Right.
do you, in real time, how do you generate? By being deeply present to what's going on here and now, and then honing in on how do we transform the situation toward life, towards beauty? And okay, we've made the move. Now the whole thing is different. It's different. Okay, and just
That's
coming
why
back
you
to
have
that.
to regenerate it every moment, because its aliveness is different than it was before.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's no
just
perfect pattern that you should be following.
100%. Yeah. And I love your talk about, because the thing with Christopher Alexander, he wrote a book called The Pattern Language, which people inappropriately interpreted as another set of things to assemble. And
I know.
where they're imposing patterns or following patterns rather than generating patterns.
Right. And
That's
being
a huge
pattern
part.
seekers. Right.
Yeah. And that's a huge part of what I'm aspiring to in my own work in permaculture. And it feels like we're moving in healthy directions to bring us back to that beautiful space, which of course is enlivening for us because we're here, we're present, we're growing and becoming more alive. The people we're working with are going in that direction, and the place itself is on the move also. And it's so much easier and it's so much more fun, and part of it is getting away from the pen and the paper or the computer screen, and you're mocking things up and testing things out, and you're also decentralizing the process itself, rather than it being the domain of these cultivated, these experts that come in. And I'm the permaculture designer, I'm going to tell you what to do for the next.
So you just said a word I realize I don't like, and I'm trying to think why and what it means. I think I know why. All right. Decentralizing.
Okay.
So, all right. So we take something which was supposedly central and we put it in lots of location. Of course, that's seen as a positive idea right now. You decentralize work. But what it actually means is fragment for the most part. And it means not understand the essence so that each thing that is an aspect of that whole could work from it. I got to go do a podcast on that. I got to go look up what is going on with this idea of decentralizing. I think it's not a good metaphor, but I can't argue with you at the moment, except it doesn't feel right.
Oh, that's good. You can't kind of complete the blow or whatever.
No, can't. But you've made me curious. I'm going to go play with it.
Yeah. What was I getting at? Just going back to what I was getting at, what I was talking about, moving away from the idea of a design expert who comes in and does the design for you, where you effectively outsource the decision making about your life and the way that your life is going to unfold in this place. You take, like these days, I construe my work as I'm not a permaculture designer. I'm a design process facilitator, where I'm going to support you to hold this process, because it's your process, and it's the very process of one of these fundamental human things of being part of co-creating your own house, your own home, your own place. And the point being that at some point I'm going to leave, because I'm a consultant that's coming from outside, and if I've left you with a pretty plan you don't really understand, you're effectively screwed, as opposed to if I've left you with the beginnings of some sort of process literacy that lets you be in the present and unfold from your own essence toward your own potential, then I mean that's a whole different thing, right?
I'm doing a new book I mentioned to you a moment ago called The Regenerative Human, which is related to what you're saying just now. The regenerative human represents 9 nodal roles on the planet that humans play, that if they do it regeneratively, society would work almost without fail. And one of those is designer, because everything gets designed at some level, even if it's a split second before we're engaging, and we have a way of thinking. And what I describe what I think is the essence of each of these 9 roles, and it's an action learning project. I would invite you and anyone who hears this podcast to reach out to me at carol@carolsanford.com and look at maybe getting involved in this action learning project. For example, the designer, which I don't know how many listeners you have, but whatever number they are, if they're in permaculture or they're in any roles designing for other people's use, they need to know what the essence of that role is. And it is not doing for someone, right? It is about articulating in a way that is totally transparent or visible what an essence to essence connection is. The essence of this place with the people at this point in time in a stream of things that have been happening, which have an essence of the story of this bigger place. And it's your job to really bring that present. And even if that's running a meeting, somebody hires an event planner, it's understanding this essence to essence connection that brings to life the story of this place. And I'm engaging with people so that they go try out a set of things I offer. They go see how it works. They come back and listen a little more. They go out and try again. Then they send me a story. And they either end up in one of my books or one of my podcasts or my trash can if they can't write it in a way I can use.
Yeah, that is so great. I mean, I've hung out with Bill Reed and Joel Glansberg, who you've mentioned, and Joel's coming over in a month or so. We're going to make some trouble together. And so
yeah.
I've had some exposure to this idea of essence to essence relationship. And after doing a workshop where they were both there a couple of years back, I brought that layer to my work, where in the past, I'd been doing something similar in terms of trying to get to the depth of what are you really about as the people? What's your essence? And also the landscape. But they gave me the realization that sometimes you can even go deeper than that. You go to a place that where it's just like,
that's right,
which is phenomenal to get there.
And the other thing is, you can't ask people what their essence is. People can't see it. They haven't been taught to.
Yep.
You can, but it takes decades again of changing the mind. But there are ways to do what I call essence light discovery. You get a taste of it, and if you can hang on to that taste, then you can play with them in this deeper connection to the place.
Yeah, well, I mean, that to me, I think is probably one of the most useful things in terms of practical. I don't know, say practical tools. It's so much more than a practical tool.
Yeah, it's not very practical. It's not a tool, but yes, otherwise you're right.
Whatever it is, for permaculture designers. So, I'm
yeah.
conscious of timeframes and stuff, but I don't know if you've got a little bit longer to go into that a little bit, like this idea of fathoming or whatever, articulating essence in a practical way, which
yeah. So I don't try and describe it to people. I do it with people because it's not describable. And the minute you get people with words, then they start trying to make it a doing, and it is not. It is an ability to see something. It's tracking of the human psychology of an individual. And so it's like trying to study a rock and think you can understand the whole human being. So I don't try and, if you want to know how to do essence dances, you come join one of my communities where we spend long periods of time getting really, really good at that, including all the guys who are doing Story of Place, all the ones you just mentioned. They're still learning to do that. So what we do it in community. So sorry, I'm happy to talk about anything else for another 15 minutes, but not trying to explain people and have them magically think they've got essence and they're now going to add it to their order of things they can do for people, because they will be full of words I can't say on here.
I love it. I love it. Really, respect and love that response. I've had it reminds me of this experience I've had sometimes where I'm doing my best to try and articulate what I'm calling a living design process. And sometimes we get towards the end of the workshop and people are like, Dan, you're trying to get this thing across. Just give us the document.
The template.
Yeah, give us the template so we can remove what we currently do and just drop that in its place.
Right.
Like,
or worse, they add it on.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's like bolted onto the side, and now I'm doing that horrible stuff I used to do, plus this wonderful thing you described, but I've refitted it so it now fits inside of my old horrible stuff.
Yeah,
so,
and with the doing stuff too, like that being distinction, that we're not talking about just a different take on some of the things you do. We're exploring a fundamentally different way of being.
And I don't want to imply to people you can't learn to do this. You can, but you have to let go of that. It's a list you get, a template that you get. I even got an email yesterday of a woman saying, I think there are techniques and this woman's studying with me. I think there are techniques I'm missing that I just need to get a handle on those techniques. And I said, if you work on the techniques, you will never learn what I'm talking about, because then you'll think you've got it down. There's this technique and this technique. Now, you got to work on your mind, but it's very doable. It's very exciting. We got a couple hundred people working on it many, many days a year because we know we need each other to do it. You need to be in community to change the mind at work.
Mm-hmm. Maybe one topic we could come back to on that front is this idea of feedback, because there's a little part of me, like a lot of it's like, I'm with you, I get it, but there's a little part of me where feedback's probably the wrong word, but it's more like what you were just talking about, what becomes possible in community, where sometimes I'm in spaces where it's just like people holding up a mirror to me. It's that kind of experience that helps me understand myself more deeply. And sometimes they talk about what they're doing and I talk about what they're doing as giving me feedback. But is there something in there that you use that?
No, that's a substitute for your capacity to see yourself.
Right.
And now we do have mirror neurons. And so if those are developed and activated, we can see people sometimes in a way they can't see themselves. But the problem is we have to get rid of all of our ego. One of the pieces of research I did for this book is just to find out what Psychology Today reports on a series of studies where people went and looked at the 360 degree and the supervisor performance review, all of those processes. And they report that 87% of what people give as feedback to other people is a projection that belongs to them. So that's not very useful, because when you look in the book, there talks about 6 major things that break down, one of which is that the mind, when it hears from outside, especially when it's been conditioned behaviorally, it starts accepting that as, oh my God, and that sounds horrible. And or it's equally bad if it sounds wonderful. It's a projection of what I'm really good at and how amazing I am, because it creates something in the mind that also happens in the machine, which it comes from, which is it creates runaway. And what I mean is the mind that heard something that was upsetting starts to try and figure out, oh my God, is that true? What does it mean? And they wake up, it's like on a treadmill trying to process it. And if it is a good, positive thing they get in their feedback, then what they do is try and keep re-enlivening it. What did they say? I got to go look that up. I got to read that again. Oh yeah, that's what they said about me. It's the mind that is no longer paying attention and learning to assess what my effects are as a living entity in a system. I am now only externally driven. So it evokes what I call external locus of control. So the control is out there, it's in you, and internal considering, which I worry about it. Now, let me give you one other really bad piece of news about feedback, besides that it is 87% projection. The other is that it's so filled with bias that it is why we cannot solve our political problems, our gender discrimination, our racial misunderstandings, is that all of that is based on conditioned cognitive dissonance and the cognitive biases. So they're now identified, in the book I put 8 of what I think are the biggest ones that make feedback not work, but there are over 100 biases that the brain bends toward. None of them make feedback work. The only thing that can learn to prevent those things, the bias, the projection, is the capacity to see our own mind at work and seeing what it's doing. And it takes a while. It's like we have to learn to get outside of ourselves and watch and say, oh, look what I just said. Oh, look at the effects that's having. Oh, look at where did I get that from? My goodness, look at how that's driving me. It's the personal development. Everything we've talked about in this hour is useless unless we're working on the personal development, the human capacity to be able to see our mind at work. So feedback is the opposite. We literally have a toggle in our brain that cannot listen to other people and listen to ourselves at the same time. We tend to, because we're conditioned now to get the behavior, right, the rewards, the recognition from outside, and we've never developed the internal capacity. We default to the external and we shut off the ability to do it internally. And we raise our children that way. From the day they're young, we teach them what they should do, what is right and wrong. We don't ask them the question, how did that feel? What happened to that child when you did that? How did you feel when they did that to you? We don't develop that capacity for them to learn to see. So I know a woman just wrote a lovely 5-star review on Amazon for an overall feedback. And she said, this book is really amazing. It shook me up, but I don't agree with any of it. There's got to be something good about feedback somewhere, because how would we ever see ourselves? And I sent her back, I said, did you read the book or did you write a review?
Yeah, that's
Anyway.
great. Yeah, so quite a clear answer there to my question is like, can't I just hold on to 5% or 10%? And really about it's increasing awareness and realizing that an addiction to feedback can basically
You want to hang on to 5% of feedback?
Well, I mean, I've been in situations, for example, where there's been 3 people opposite me. We're doing an exercise, and I snap into as if I'm in a workshop, and I present for a minute or two, and we stop.
Yeah.
One of them will say, try saying the same thing, but just at half speed, which to me sounds ridiculous. It's like,
okay, that's
but
not
I do
feedback.
it. Okay, good.
That's not feedback.
That's
all right.
I was talking about.
So there are 2 things we do. The inability of us to be self-managed is a capability problem. We need to build that. The second is that anything other people gives us need to be seen as reflections that come through their life experience without any certainty that has anything to do with what you just did.
Yeah.
So if people would say to you, well, I can share what my experience was, or I can give you a reflection, but I have no idea whether I'm right. We've just stopped the feedback. We just literally stopped the runaway in the brain.
Yep.
That's not feedback.
Great. Beautiful. That's
You're relieved, right? Take a deep breath.
So relieved.
All is good.
That is what I needed to hear from you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Like I was saying, so much of the other stuff in addition to the stuff during this podcast that you've, I don't know, just destroyed or something, or pointed
undermined, probably a little bit.
Let's say, yeah. Doing what you do as a contrarian and a disruptor. Brainstorming and other things. It's like, yeah, totally get it. And that in permaculture, that can be a thing. Effectively, we're going to look at what exists. We're going to basically do some brainstorming. We're going to come up. I mean, it actually gets to this point. I know people who do this. They say we're going to come up with 4 different options for the client, and the client can pick this part of this option, and we'll bring those together, and then we'll sell that plan, which to me is this enormous tragedy in terms of what
it's a terrible tragedy.
Permaculture's essence and what permaculture's here to do. Oh man, I'm realizing we're about to wrap up, but that was a whole thing. Hopefully, I can talk you to another chat sometime. Because I'm myself exploring this question of, well, what is permaculture's essence and potential in the world? How do we unfold that? How do we develop that? And so on. That's what I'm really excited to do.
Teaching us as humans to play a role inside of a living system that we understand and can contribute to.
Can you say that again?
Probably not.
Oh no, don't worry. I'm recording this. I can get it later.
Okay. It was what I felt as I was listening to you. I think you have an educator role. Permaculturists have an educator role, which is very powerful, about having people learn to see something alive in this place. So the problem with what you just described is people doing 4 different plans is all of those are completely abstracted from the place and the story that is in that place and the humans that are in it. It's all generics. I've got a template I can shuffle, and now, okay, pick what you want, mix and match. There's nothing about that has anything to do with life.
Yeah, 100%.
All right.
Far out, Carol. It's almost like, I don't know. I feel like it's like you're someone I'd have to have 5 conversations with just so we could actually, like clean up the language enough. Or maybe it would just, maybe this would just continue indefinitely. I don't know.
Yeah, there's no way to clean up the language. It's lifelong. Ask anybody who's worked with me for 25 years.
Yeah, well, I remember those lines from Ethan. That's right. But yeah, well, I mean, I'm conscious of time and I don't want to use up any more of your precious time.
I got to go to dinner with some friends, but this has been delightful.
Oh, thank you. It's been delightful for me also. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'll link to all your stuff and your books.
Great. I would love for people to come join the Regenerative Human if they want. Tell them how to get a hold of me. Yep. Really, where the business second opinion is growing like crazy. Share it with your friends.
I will. Yeah.
Love to have all of you connected. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for what you're doing and creating this space, this medium. I'm certainly even more motivated to continue tuning to what you're up to, and hopefully at some point actually get across and hang out face to face.
Yeah, well, I have some local events down in your part of the world, so we ought to talk about that.
We ought to talk about that. Yeah, maybe you can send me some links or I'll look them up or whatever, and I'll certainly link to those.
I'll send you a link.
On the show note. All right, thank you so much for your time, Carol.
You're welcome.
All right, catch you later.
Bye.
Bye.